He possessed all that a man could desire: vast tracts of land, the finest equestrian stock, and the esteem of every rancher within a 300-mile radius. However, when Silas Ward rode back into his familiar hometown on that parched afternoon, none of his accumulated wealth or influence held any significance. There, positioned upon a wooden platform in the heart of the town square, stood the woman he had cherished since his 17th year. She was being put up for sale. The auctioneer's voice sliced through the afternoon air with the keenness of a blade. "What am I bid for this fine woman? Strong hands, good for cooking and cleaning." The starting bid was a mere $1. Clarabelle maintained her composure, her head held high. Yet Silas could discern the tremor in her hands and the way she bit her lip, suppressing the urge to weep. It was the same lip he had kissed behind the old church 23 years prior, when they were young and the world felt boundless with possibility. Silas brought his horse to a halt, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. His intention was merely to settle his father's estate, nothing more. 3 days in and out, he had assured himself. But observing Clara on that platform, clad in a faded dress that was once a vibrant blue, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, yet still capturing the sunlight as it always had, felt as if a hand had reached into his chest and clutched his heart. A rough-looking man positioned near the platform raised his hand. $1. His grin exposed several missing teeth, and the way he eyed Clara sent a wave of nausea through Silas. Other men began to converse amongst themselves, appraising her as if she were livestock. Clara's green eyes scanned the assembled onlookers, and for a fleeting moment they met Silas's gaze. The recognition struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her lips parted in disbelief, and she instinctively took a step back. Silas contemplated turning his horse and departing. He had cultivated his fortune by maintaining a low profile and avoiding the entanglements of others' predicaments. However, witnessing Clara standing there, surrounded by individuals who viewed her as mere chattel to be acquired, something within him fractured. He had spent 23 years contemplating the path not taken, the what-ifs, had he remained. Now he was about to discover the answer. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "Going once for $1 to Mr. Tobias Crow." Clara closed her eyes, resigned to her fate. But Silas Ward was not prepared to allow the woman he had never stopped loving to be surrendered to the highest bidder. He opened his mouth to speak, aware that the ensuing moments would irrevocably alter everything. What he did not anticipate, however, was that Clarabelle harbored a secret that would render his intervention far more perilous than he could possibly conceive. $500. Silas's voice resonated across the town square like the crack of a gunshot. Every head swiveled in his direction, and a wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. $500 represented a sum far exceeding what most of these individuals earned in an entire year. The auctioneer's jaw slackened, his gavel suspended in mid-air. Tobias Crow's countenance contorted with fury. He was a man accustomed to obtaining whatever he desired, and the instinctive movement of his hand towards his firearm conveyed to Silas the grim reality of the individual Clara would have been subjected to. "Now hold on there, stranger. This here's a local matter." Silas dismounted with deliberate slowness, his boots making contact with the dry earth with a measured authority. 23 years of building an empire had instilled in him the ability to command any space, and every eye was now fixed upon him. He was attired in fine clothing, a tailored coat, polished boots, and a gold watch chain that gleamed in the sunlight. But it was his bearing, the way he carried himself, that compelled men to yield as he advanced towards the platform. "The auctioneer called for bids," Silas stated, his voice steady, yet possessing an underlying edge that prompted prudent men to reconsider. "I'm bidding." He produced a substantial roll of currency, more cash than anyone present in that square had ever witnessed in one place. Clara's eyes widened, but her expression conveyed more than just surprise. It held a palpable sense of dread. The crowd surged closer, sensing impending drama. Ezekiel Marsh, the local banker who had orchestrated this entire proceeding, nervously moistened his lips. He had anticipated obtaining approximately $50 for Clara, a sum barely sufficient to cover a portion of her deceased husband's accumulated gambling debts. $500 was an astronomical figure. "This woman owes money to some very dangerous people," Marsh whispered urgently to Silas. "People who won't take kindly to being cheated out of their arrangement." His implication was unmistakable. Clara was not merely being sold for financial gain, but rather for protection, or at least the illusion thereof. Silas felt Clara's intense gaze fixed upon him. When he met her eyes, she gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head. She was attempting to dissuade him, to shield him from some impending danger. However, Silas Ward had not amassed his fortune by retreating from formidable adversaries, nor was he about to commence doing so now. "Going once," the auctioneer called, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "Going twice for $500 to the gentleman in the fine coat." Tobias Crow spat in the dust and strode away, but not before casting a menacing look at Silas that promised further confrontation. As the gavel descended, Silas grasped that securing Clara's liberation was merely the prelude. The way Ezekiel Marsh was regarding him, with a predatory calculation, signaled that he had just positioned himself as the target of every opportunist in town, and Clara's terrified expression suggested that the worst was yet to unfold. Clara descended from the platform on unsteady legs, her eyes never leaving Silas's face. The crowd began to disperse, but Silas could still feel their stares, hear their hushed exchanges. He had just broadcast his considerable wealth to the entire community. In a place such as this, such information travelled with alarming speed to all the wrong ears. "Silas Ward," Clara murmured, her voice reaching him softly, precisely as he remembered it, gentle yet underscored by that subtle tremor that surfaced only when she fought back tears. "You shouldn't have done this. You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into." Before he could reply, Ezekiel Marsh materialized beside him, exuding a facade of false amiability and nervous energy. "Mr. Ward, is it? Perhaps we could discuss the terms of this arrangement in my office. There are certain complications regarding Mrs. Bell's situation that need to be addressed." Silas found Marsh's furtive glances between him and Clara unsettling, as was the man's habitual twitching towards his coat pocket. "What kind of complications?" Silas inquired. "The kind that lead to injury," Clara whispered urgently. "Silas, please, take your money and leave town." "Forget you saw me here." But Silas's attention was now drawn past her, noticing details he had overlooked in the heat of the moment. 3 men casually leaning against the saloon wall, observing them with the patient intensity of predators, a 4th individual on horseback at the far end of the street, poised to carry news, and Marsh himself sweating despite the cooling afternoon air. Her deceased husband, may he rest in peace, owed money to some investors from the territorial capital, Marsh explained, his voice lowering to a confidential whisper. "Very serious investors, the kind who don't accept refusal. They've already made inquiries regarding collection methods." A chill snaked down Silas's spine. He recognized the type. Men who profited from the desperation of others, who regarded violence as a standard business practice. Clara's husband had incurred debts with loan sharks, and now she was expected to repay with her freedom or something more dire. "How much?" Silas asked directly. Marsh's smile broadened, revealing teeth akin to a ravenous wolf's. $2,000 plus interest plus penalties for late payment. The emphasis on penalties made it clear that money was not the sole currency these individuals operated with. Clara's face drained of color. "You told me it was 500, she protested. "You said if I went through with this auction, the debt would be settled." "That was before our friend here demonstrated he has deep pockets," Marsh replied smoothly. The investors will be most interested to learn about this development, very interested indeed. Silas felt a growing sense of dread as he realized his impulsive act of chivalry had effectively marked both of them. And judging by Clara's expression, a mixture of gratitude and sheer terror, he understood that some obligations could not be discharged solely with monetary means. The distinct sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the palpable tension like the prelude to a storm. 5 riders were advancing down the main thoroughfare, their demeanor exuding the purposeful calm of men accustomed to asserting their will through intimidation. Their leader, a tall man clad in a dark coat, bore a facial scar indicative of a past altercation. Even from a distance, Silas discerned the glint of metal beneath the man's jacket. "That's them," Clara breathed, her hand instinctively closing around Silas's arm. "That's Nathaniel Cross and his men. They came through 3 weeks ago, right after they buried my husband. They gave me 30 days to settle the debt, or—" She left the sentence unfinished, but the tremor in her voice conveyed the unspoken threat. Marsh straightened his waistcoat and donned an unctuous smile. "Mr. Cross, right on time. I was just explaining to our new friend here about the expanded nature of Mrs. Bell's obligations." Cross dismounted with fluid grace, his cold, appraising eye sweeping over the scene, the dispersing crowd, Silas's expensive attire, Clara's visibly frightened countenance. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, yet it carried an inherent authority born from years of silencing individuals. "Ezekiel tells me someone's been playing hero," Cross stated, advancing closer to Silas. $500 is commendable, but it barely covers the accrued interest. You've complicated a straightforward business transaction. Silas held his ground, though every fiber of his being urged him to reach for his firearm. "What will it take to settle this completely?" "All of it." Cross offered a smile devoid of any warmth. "Well, now that's an entirely different discussion. You see, Mrs. Bell's husband didn't just owe money, he owed services. And when a man cannot satisfy his obligations, sometimes his family must fulfill those debts in alternative capacities." Clara's sharp inhalation confirmed that this was the first she had heard of such a stipulation. Marsh had deceived her regarding the true nature of the debt. In all likelihood, he had misled her about everything. She was not merely being sold to settle a financial sum, she was being transferred to satisfy some sort of criminal obligation. 2,000 Cross continued. "Furthermore, she will work off her service obligation. 3 years at one of my establishments located in the capital. These are non-negotiable terms." The pronouncement struck Silas as if he had been physically assaulted. Clara's spouse had effectively sold her to criminals prior to his demise, and she was entirely unaware of this fact. The entire auction had been a charade. Cross most likely held ownership of Marsh, and indeed the entire arrangement. They had intended to apprehend her regardless of who submitted a bid. "There is a third alternative," Cross added, his hand casually drifting towards his firearm. "You can depart this location at this moment, erase your recollection of any of this, and Mrs. Bell will accompany us without resistance. No one will sustain harm, and you will retain your financial resources and your life. Contemplate this carefully, stranger. Certain obligations carry a value exceeding mere monetary worth." Silas observed Clara, perceiving the acceptance of her fate in her eyes, the manner in which she was already withdrawing from him to shield him from her predestined outcome. For 23 years he had lived with the regret of abandoning her. Now he possessed a single opportunity to rectify his past actions. However, pursuing this course of action could potentially result in their mutual deaths. The crucial inquiry was whether Silas Ward remained the same individual who had fled all those years ago, or if he had evolved into someone befitting the substantial fortune he had amassed. "I will tender the 2,000, Silas stated softly, his hand moving towards his coat. However, Cross had already begun to shake his head, even before Silas had fully articulated his words. "You are failing to comprehend, my friend. This matter no longer pertains to financial transactions. You see, Mrs. Bell's husband was meant to facilitate the movement of specific contraband through this territory on our behalf. When he met his end in that card game, he left us with a predicament. We require someone conversant with the local intricacies, the sheriff's routines, the individuals who inquire, and those who remain silent. Clara's countenance crumbled as the complete gravity of her predicament became starkly apparent. Her husband had not merely squandered their financial assets through gambling. He had been engaged in illicit dealings with criminals, and now she was expected to assume his role in whatever illegal enterprise Cross was orchestrating. "I possess no knowledge regarding my husband's affairs," Clara articulated, her voice barely audible. "I am incapable of assisting you with whatever he pledged." Cross emitted a laugh, a sound akin to the grating of glass. "Oh, you will acquire the necessary knowledge. My associates invariably do. And should you prove of no utility in terms of providing information, rest assured there exist alternative methods for discharging a debt. Regardless of the outcome, you will accompany us." It was at this juncture that Silas noticed the burgeoning assembly that had once again congregated, drawn by the palpable tension. However, these were not merely inquisitive townsfolk. He recognized some of them from earlier encounters. Tobias Crow had reappeared, accompanied by 3 other gentlemen who had participated in the bidding for Clara. They were strategically positioning themselves throughout the central square, effectively blocking any potential escape routes. Marsh was visibly perspiring now, his agitated demeanor revealing that the situation had escalated far beyond his initial intentions. "Gentlemen, perhaps we might engage in a more private discussion of these matters. The entire populace is observing our proceedings." "Permit them to observe," Cross declared. "It may serve as a cautionary lesson regarding the repercussions of interceding in affairs that do not concern them." His hand now rested openly upon his sidearm, and his associates had dispersed in a well-rehearsed formation. Silas apprehended with absolute clarity that he had inadvertently walked into a meticulously laid trap. The auction had been deliberately designed as a lure to expose anyone possessing either wealth or influence who might potentially impede Cross's objectives. By participating in the bidding, he had identified himself as both affluent and emotionally invested, precisely the sort of precarious loose end that individuals like Cross were predisposed to eliminate. "Clara," Silas uttered softly, his gaze remaining fixed upon Cross. "When I was 17 years of age, I made a promise to you. Do you recall it?" She regarded him with an expression of bewilderment and escalating apprehension. "Silas, who are you? I vowed that I would never permit anyone to inflict harm upon you. I violated that commitment once when I departed this town. I shall not transgress it again." Cross's composure was rapidly deteriorating. "Enough discourse, Mrs. Bell, ascend upon the horse. Mr. Hero here can observe our departure, or he can prepare his own final resting place. The decision rests with him." However, as Cross extended his hand to grasp Clara's arm, Silas initiated an action that surprised everyone present, including himself. Rather than reaching for his firearm, he stepped directly into Cross's personal space, positioning himself close enough to prevent Cross from drawing his weapon without initiating a direct physical confrontation. "There is something you should be apprised of concerning my character," Silas stated in a voice that resonated across the entire square. "I did not achieve financial prosperity by yielding to bullies. The atmosphere within the square was so charged with tension that it could have been severed with a blade. Cross's operatives had their hands resting on their weapons, but Silas maintained a proximity to their leader that precluded them from acting without jeopardizing Cross's life. It was a perilous undertaking, yet Silas had spent 23 years honing his ability to assess individuals, and he could discern the calculated thought process evident in Cross's eyes. "You are making a grave error," Cross declared through clenched teeth. I have 8 operatives stationed within this town. You, on the other hand, have only yourself and whatever concealed items you possess within that ostentatious coat." Silas offered a grim smile. "An amusing observation regarding the establishment of a cattle empire. You learned that wolves invariably congregate in packs, but they disperse with haste when they encounter an entity of superior stature." He amplified his voice to ensure it reached every corner of the square. "My designation is Silas Ward. I am the proprietor of the Triple W Ranch, the most extensive operation spanning 3 territories. I employ 50 armed individuals on my payroll, and every sheriff from this locale to the territorial capital is acquainted with my name." The fabrication flowed effortlessly, yet it was not entirely devoid of truth. Silas did possess connections and wielded influence. What he lacked, however, were 50 armed men within immediate riding distance. But Cross was not privy to this crucial detail. Clara gazed at him with a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. The young man she had once known had been ambitious, but possessed a limited stature, perpetually boasting, but lacking the inherent confidence to substantiate his pronouncements. This individual, confronting armed adversaries head-on, was an entirely different person. Cross's gaze narrowed perceptibly. Bold declarations from an individual on the verge of his demise. Perhaps, Silas conceded, but observe, the consequence of achieving success is that individuals take notice when one vanishes. And when they commence their investigation, as they inevitably will discover this entire township populated by eyewitnesses who observed Nathaniel Cross perpetrating the murder of a legitimate businessman in broad daylight. For the first instance, Cross displayed a flicker of uncertainty. Criminal enterprises relied upon maintaining a low profile, evading the scrutiny of territorial authorities. The act of terminating a prosperous rancher in a public setting was precisely the sort of attention that invariably attracted federal marshals and severe repercussions. Marsh's complexion had paled to the hue of morning mist. "Now, esteemed gentlemen, I'm confident we can arrive at a mutually agreeable resolution. Perhaps Mr. Ward could settle the outstanding debt, and we could all extricate ourselves from this unfortunate misunderstanding." "Silence, Ezekiel," Cross barked, yet his voice lacked its preceding assuredness. He found himself ensnared between the imperative of preserving his reputation and the primal instinct of self-preservation, and each moment of his hesitation served to diminish his perceived strength before his subordinates. It was at this critical juncture that Clara acted in a manner that surprised all observers. She advanced resolutely, positioning herself directly between Silas and the menacing barrel of Cross's firearm. "Enough. I shall accompany you willingly if you permit him to depart unharmed. No other individual needs to suffer injury." "Clara, no!" Silas exclaimed, his voice sharp with alarm, but she silenced him with a definitive look. "This obligation is mine, my responsibility. I will not permit your blood to be shed as well." Her voice had acquired a newfound steadiness, imbued with the quiet fortitude that had initially captivated him all those years prior. Cross smirked, sensing an impending triumph. "A sensible woman. You perceive how effortlessly this situation could have been resolved." But as he reached out once more to grasp Clara's arm, a new voice pierced the oppressive silence like the sharp crack of a whip. "I would strongly advise against such an action if I were in your position." All heads turned to observe a man bearing the insignia of a marshal, striding purposefully into the square, his hand resting casually upon the grip of his sidearm. Following closely behind him rode 6 armed deputies, their weapons already drawn and menacingly aimed at Cross's confederates. The reinforcements had arrived, yet Silas could not entirely dispel the disquieting premonition that the true peril was only just beginning to unfold. Marshal Tom Brennan had been in pursuit of Cross for a duration of 3 months, meticulously tracing a trail of extortion and more heinous offences across two separate territories. What he had not anticipated was to ride into town and discover his quarry engaged in a public confrontation with a well-dressed rancher and a woman who clearly had no place in this perilous entanglement. "Nathaniel Cross," Brennan declared, his voice resonating with the unquestionable authority of federal law. "You are hereby placed under arrest on charges of racketeering, extortion, and complicity in the demise of Samuel Bell." Cross's countenance drained of all colour. Samuel Bell, Clara's husband, had not perished in a mere card game accident. He had been systematically murdered when he attempted to withdraw from his clandestine arrangement with Cross. The entire narrative of the debt was a fabricated ruse designed to compel Clara into assuming her husband's obligated services. "You cannot substantiate any of these accusations," Cross snarled, his hand making a furtive movement towards his firearm. "A peculiar characteristic of deceased individuals," Brennan responded with unflappable composure. "At times they leave behind written correspondence. Samuel Bell meticulously documented all relevant details prior to his assassination. He recorded names, dates, and essential connections. He had been in possession of this information for several weeks, awaiting the opportune moment for its disclosure. This revelation struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Her husband had not been the dissolute gambler she had erroneously believed him to be. He had been endeavoring to safeguard her by extricating himself from Cross's illicit operation, and he had ultimately paid the ultimate price for his intentions. Cross initiated his aggressive maneuver. Cross swiftly drew his weapon in a single fluid motion. However, Silas remained sufficiently close to intercept the man's arm, causing the shot to go astray. The square dissolved into pandemonium as Cross's associates lunged for their firearms, only to find themselves outmatched by the strategic positioning of Brennan's deputies. Once the acrid smoke dissipated, Cross lay incapacitated on the ground, bearing a gunshot wound to his shoulder. His surviving operatives were promptly taken into custody. Marsh, in a futile attempt to escape, had not managed to traverse beyond the general store before a deputy apprehended him, unceremoniously tackling him into the dirt. "Are you injured?" Silas inquired of Clara, his hands gently assessing her for any signs of physical harm. She was trembling, though no longer from fear, but from an overwhelming sense of relief so profound it threatened to buckle her knees. "I believed I was destined to lose everything," she whispered. "My home, my liberty, potentially my life. I feared I was going to lose you once more before I had even managed to reclaim you." Silas drew her into a close embrace, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of her hair. "You are not losing anything. Not to individuals like Cross, not to debts that never truly existed, and certainly not to the shadows of the past." Marshal Brennan approached them, tipping his hat in a gesture of profound respect. "Mrs. Bell, you are at liberty to depart. The obligation ceased to exist upon the commission of your husband's murder. Silas, your intervention was invaluable. Mr. Ward, I am indebted to you. Your well-timed diversion provided the crucial opportunity we required." As twilight deepened, casting long shadows across the town plaza, Silas and Clara stood side by side, observing the constables escorting Cross and his associates into a paddy wagon. The onlookers had finally dispersed, leaving Silas and Clara to their reflections and the 23 years that had passed them by. "What is our next step?" Clara inquired gently. Silas clasped her hand, noting the rough texture that testified to arduous labor and challenging circumstances. "We have a fresh beginning, should you desire it." A genuine smile graced Clara's lips for the first time in many months, an expression that illuminated her features and evoked faint memories of the young woman he had cherished. "I have always wanted this, Silas. I never lost hope that you would return." They departed the plaza hand in hand, leaving behind the marketplace, the financial burdens, and the individuals who had attempted to pilfer their shared destiny. Occasionally, bygone events resurface not to bring remorse, but to offer absolution. At times, affection possesses the fortitude to endure 2 decades and 3 years for its opportune moment. And sometimes, a prosperous landowner's spontaneous offer at a $1 auction holds a value surpassing any earthly fortune. If this narrative resonated with you, select the video now displayed on your screen to experience another remarkable account where fate and valor intertwine in unforeseen ways. Please remember to subscribe and consider a super chat to support our continued creation of similar stories. Your patronage is profoundly appreciated.